Welcome back to Feminism Concepts and Theories, and for our last lecture for this week, in continuation with our discussion on care, I want to read with you a couple of things. In the first instance, I am going to take up two case studies given in our text in the chapter on care, that is, our text being Key Concepts in Feminist Theory and Research. And for the last part of this lecture, I will read to you substantive portions of an article on surrogacy in India. So, let us start then with case study 10 titled Who Prepares Dinner Tonight? Min, and this is a study in 1999, remarks, it is universally acknowledged that the kitchen is the world of women. Now, remember, this is something that is being said by a woman who is claiming universal principles to say that the kitchen is the world of women, and this is very much part of what I might call a feminine ethic of care, that the kitchen is the woman's domain. Her research is focused on the changing role of women in 20th century China, and China is particularly interesting because, like a lot of countries that are familiar to the global south or what used to be called the developing nations of the world, we see that these countries have experienced rapid change in their social environment in the last 50 to 100 years. Her research, her methodology, is comprised of a narrative enquiry based on interviews with women from 4 generations of one Chinese family. And this research is just among women, which means that we are going to be able to see the ways in which the nature of care or the idea of care also changes across time. These are Ms. Li, a housewife aged 90 years who had completed primary school, Ms. Zhang, aged 69 years, a retired doctor, Ms. Wang, a 40-year-old mother and university lecturer, and Lian Lian, aged 10 years, a primary school student. Min's findings illustrate the considerable differences of time spent in the kitchen by these women, and this is a really interesting variable to collect because you are working through the idea of the process of care. Very simply coming down to brass tacks, how much time do each of these women spend in the kitchen? They are separated by generations, hence by cultural contexts, they are separated by professions, they are separated by age. Ms. Li spends about 10 hours a day on housework. Ms. Li, if you remember, is the housewife aged 90 years who had completed primary school. Ms. Zhang spends less than an hour per day. Ms. Zhang is a retired doctor. And Ms. Wang spends about 2 hours. Ms. Wang is a 40-year-old mother and university lecturer. Min comments that apart from reasons such as diminishing family size, help by older family members and employment, an essential factor that has influenced women's activity in the kitchen is the changing attitudes of women towards housework across the 3 generations. For example, for Ms. Li, who was born at the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 2 ways in which women could demonstrate their worth. This was through bearing a son and through caring for their families. Here you begin to see how is it that care takes on multiply different meanings. Caring is not just something that is fundamental to Ms. Li, it also is a way for her to indicate to the outside world what kind of person she is, and it's also a medium for the world to be able to judge what kind of woman she is. This was through bearing a son, like we mentioned, through caring for their families. Ms. Zhang lived in an age when equality in terms of sameness was stressed, and women were expected to engage in paid work in the same ways as men. Equal rights feminism, liberal feminism, what have you. Ms. Wang was born at a time when there was strong questioning of sameness equality, and where a woman of good qualities should not merely seek success in her career, but should also aspire to being a good wife and mother at home. And this trope of the Wonder Woman is fairly familiar to a lot of people in modern South Asia, for example, where you're expected to be brilliant both outside in the public domain and in the private domain, and something that is seemingly liberating, that seemingly allows women to be all sorts of things, also extricates from them double the labor of just one or the other. While women across these generations spend different times in the kitchen, this does not mean that caring is no longer women's work. As Min notes, there is no indication that the well-entrenched sex role patterns will become history in the 21st century. What a case study like this indicates is that across these generations, sex roles are reorganizing themselves. They are not going away, they are just reconfiguring different formations of power. And a case study method allows us to be able to see these changes. The reduced time in the kitchen that are features of the lives of Ms. Zhang and Ms. Wang was due to buying in help or through the use of female family members. So, just because these women were able to spend lesser time in the kitchen did not mean that the work was automatically done by men or shared by men. It just meant that it moved to other kinds of positions on the class and age spectrum. It moved to other women whose care work was expected in order to be able to secure the liberation of these women. For example, Ms. Li takes on the housework for Ms. Zhang. In this regard, it is pertinent to note that the toy that the child in the family, Lian, prizes most is the plastic kitchen that her father bought her for her 5th birthday. And as an epilogue to the study, Min notes that at the close of her research, Ms. Wang moved to a new house with a kitchen that was twice the size of her previous one. In addition, she has spent 10 times her and her husband's salaries for a month on refurbishing the kitchen. The end of this case study is greatly interesting because it brings us to the site of care, which is the kitchen. Lian loves the plastic kitchen, which is not to say that she is going to condemn herself to a lifetime of housework, but it does point to the ways in which care or care work is part of the socialization of young female children. Ms. Wang moved to a new house where she spent a ginormous amount of money on refurbishing the kitchen. What does this indicate? It indicates that women also internalize the work of care and think it important to the process of forming one's own identity. This allows us to hark back to the earlier part of the case study where Min remarks, "It is universally acknowledged that the kitchen is the world of women." Keep this in mind. And a case study method is really great to be able to understand how is it that care is a cluster concept. It is involved in the way that patriarchy functions and configures the roles of men and women, and that these roles are not set in stone, they do change. However, power, patriarchal power continues to reconfigure itself. Think about reading this again in cohort with our lecture today in order to understand how terms that we discussed and concepts that we discussed are applicable in this case study. For our second case study 11, we are looking at something called the case of taking care, which involves another important site of socialization of gender, which is schools. Schroeder has undertaken a policy analysis of the introduction into the curriculum for secondary education in the Netherlands of the subject taking care. This subject has been introduced because it is assumed in the Netherlands that everyone from the age of 18 years of age has to be self-supporting, which necessarily involves taking care. Already you see a couple of key differences. Here a relationship is made between the capacity to take care and the capacity to be independent. In other words, one can see this from the point of view of the cared for. That is, everyone should either have a job, try to find a job, or go to school of some kind in order to be self-supporting. One of the main consequences of this policy is that neither parents nor girls nor women can say that they, girls and women, do not really need an education because they will get married and have children. So, think about the ways in which particular forms of legislative reform as compelled upon a population have the capacity to produce changes in gender configurations. I am not arguing if such an authoritative sort of way of functioning is good or bad, I am only asking you to pay attention. Another consequence is that boys too need to be prepared for a future in which gender roles are no longer what they used to be. And why is this? Because the act of care cannot be taken for granted. You will not necessarily have any kind of female relative at home willing to offer processes of care. A central question of Schroeder's research is whether or not the introduction of taking care will contribute to greater gender equality. This is a research study and the researcher is asking if the introduction of something like this will necessarily contribute to gender equality. The analysis illustrates some significant changes to the educational aims of taking care from its first introduction in 1993, relatively recent, to its revision in 1996. In 1993, the aims were primarily focused on domestic care. In other words, everybody needs to know how to take care of themselves in a private domain. This received a lot of criticism both in schools and in the media because a very common opinion is that taking care is not a real school subject because pupils learn how to clean the bathroom and how to cook eggs. Now, in my understanding, this sounds fairly progressive. I mean, I remember in many cases, and I am sure this is still the case, schools in this part of the world had a subject called home science. And who is it that used to be the kind of people, who were the kind of people that would primarily take home science? Usually girls, and very rarely in some schools they had carpentry, and often the teachers would assign boys and girls separately to these subjects. This might still be the norm, or there might be interventions in education depending on the context where there is a gender mixed understanding of what kinds of students should do what. In other words, valuable time in school is wasted upon the trivial and unnecessary. So, cooking eggs, cleaning the bathroom were considered to be unnecessary and trivial in this kind of education context. Schroeder notes that the revisions enacted in 1996 show a different concept of care and caretaking as well as different educational ideas. In particular, care is conceptualized as including the public as well as the private sphere. This has meant that there is a shift in emphasis away from practical skills and correct behavior towards a notion of care in which knowledge, judgment and action are treated in coherence. Overall, this has meant that not only are pupils taught what to do, they are now also encouraged to make reasonable and responsible decisions related to questions of care. Notice how the educational impetus has moved from just the process of care or the set of activities that are part of caretaking or caregiving to a larger feminist ethic of care, which is how is it that you teach students to function in the world through a feminist ethic of care. For example, pupils have to learn to think about different aspects and different phases of care in order to make them more conscious of the importance of care in a broad sense for their own lives now and in the future. The apolitical casualness of care in the domestic sphere is now made into a subject for conversation, discussion and critical reflection. Care and caretaking are no longer part of the private domain only, but are made an integral part of the cognitive, rational, public and political domain. In other words, exactly what we have been trying to do in today's lecture. Schroeder argues that these features of taking care do suggest that it could contribute to greater gender equality. In particular, the inclusion of so-called masculine values of reasoned argument and the incorporation of the public sphere have led to a serious acknowledgement of care and caretaking as an important area of learning for all pupils. Thus, while Schroeder is cautious in claiming that such a course that is a small part of the overall curriculum will make an enormous difference to gendered responsibilities for care, she does argue that this course has made care a visible public policy issue. Now, spend some time on this case study. Think about the set of concepts that are finding their way into this: feminine versus feminist ethics of care, questions of socialization, questions of the site of care, questions of whether care is a universal or relativist ethic, so on and so forth. But most importantly, to me this case study is important because it explores the possibilities of feminist intervention. For the last part of this lecture, I want to read with you an article on the commercial surrogacy industry in India. The reason I want to do this is because I think care is a central concern of the questions raised by this article. This is also a practice that I want to continue to follow as we go along, because we will be reading from a lot of contemporary feminist work in order to try and understand how is it that concepts can be deployed, or why is it that concepts are important, or what are the ways in which they allow us different possibilities of feminist intervention. Today's article is titled "Commercial Surrogacy in India, Manufacturing a Perfect Mother Worker." This was written by Amrita Pandey in 2010 for the journal Science, SIGNS, Journal of Women in Culture and Society, 2010, volume 35, number 4. What I am going to do is read to you large sections of the article. So, if you are interested, please go back and read the whole thing. But these sections will help illustrate the ways in which care as work in the public domain in an industry such as surrogacy moves back and forth between feminine and feminist ethics and the idea of women as both caring as well as economically independent subjects in the world. Everything works like clockwork. We wake up at 8 a.m., have tea, take our medicines and injections and go back to sleep. Then we wake up at noon, bathe and eat lunch. We basically rest. That's what is required of us. We are allowed visitors, but not for the night. In the evening, we pray. Then the English tutor comes and teaches us how to speak in English. We will be learning how to use a computer next. This is a quote in the article from Tina, a surrogate mother, describing the timetable at a surrogacy hostel in Anand, Gujarat, India. Feminist ethnographers, those who chronicle contemporary conditions through ethnography, which is a process of qualitative, deeply immersive research, have often ventured into factories and global assembly lines to watch what they call gender at work. In this article, surrogacy is very clearly work, and hence the term commercial surrogacy. And they have demonstrated that good labor, cheap, docile, dexterous, is not found ready-made. It is created through relations of production, through the meaningful practices and rhetorics of shop floor life. Within this schema, managerial control operates through the constitution of shop floor subjects. The argument in this article borrows from other understandings of gender in other industries, where they say you have to make a good, docile worker, a worker who is willing to listen, therefore at the feminine end of the spectrum. In this article, the author, I argue that the perfect commercial surrogate, like the perfect laborer of global production, is not found ready-made in India. Unlike common stories which say that India has been a great surrogacy destination, it's a different matter that in the current moment, commercial surrogacy is no longer allowed. But until recently, it continued to thrive as an important industry. The perfect surrogate, cheap, docile, selfless and, here's our keyword, nurturing, is produced in the fertility clinics and surrogacy hostels. When one's identity as a mother is regulated and terminated by a contract, being a good mother often conflicts with being a good worker, which makes the perfect surrogate subject rather difficult to produce. I hope you begin to see why this is important to the discussion on care. Here we are talking about identity as a mother as well as identity as a worker. But unlike in the sites where we said that women working is a difficult proposition because they have to go to work as well as take care of the home, here the very act of producing a child, usually the domain of private unpaid care work, is being brought into the public domain as paid care work for some other mothers who are willing to pay for somebody else to do the work for them because for a number of reasons they are unable to. It requires a disciplinary project that works both discursively through language and metaphor, through the materialization of discourses in the form of spaces or enclosures where good mothers are formed. Move on to the next paragraph here. The production of this mother-worker subject, however, does not go unchallenged. The surrogates resist being reduced to the disposable and docile subjects of medical discourses by creating alternative worlds of meaning for themselves. Ironically, these resistances at the discursive level, at the level of language, often reinforce the primary identity of these women as selfless mothers rather than as wage-earning workers, which further undermines their ability to negotiate the payment received. Look at how interesting a paragraph this is. Here we see that those that work in this industry, by performing in their capacity as expectant mothers, often refuse the idea that they are cold and selfless and are only doing it for money. Instead, they provide explanations that say that we are merely trying to help out other women who want to be mothers. We are performing selfless acts of caring for those women and for the children that the women are going to be given. Because they produce themselves as good mothers in this fashion, often they are not able to negotiate their payment with precisely the women for who they want to perform these selfless acts of caring. I am using this as a case study to suggest to you, therefore, that this kind of slippage between the private and the public, as seen in the surrogacy industry, is a really interesting possibility for further conceptualizations of care. We will return to these and other kinds of discussions in the week where we discuss feminist body as well as feminist understandings of work and labor. Until then, congratulations on having successfully completed week 3. Until next week.